And I was more sensitive about it then because when you're new, you've got so much to prove. You don't have that many chances.
Critics everywhere have been slamming her performances of Video Games and Blue Jeans, calling Del Rey's performance, quote, one of the worst outings in SNL history.
You are seriously depressed. That's why you're so popular.
Is it freeing now to feel that you can do sort of whatever feels good in that moment?
Yeah.
What would you say to your fans?
Find someone who has a life that you want and figure out how they got it. Read books. Pick your role models wisely.
What would you say to all the haters?
I don't think I would say anything.
I lost my balance. And you know, that's when the colors started to change.
At one point in time, it seemed like Lana Del Rey was set up to be the world's largest musician. She was everything glamorous and charming, and sang about death in a way that made it sound beautiful, like a gift. With songs like Video Games and Summertime Sadness making rounds on social media and the radio respectively, it would be a surprise to the whole world watching if nothing became of her. The truth is, love her or hate her, there's something special about Lana Del Rey. But I've got to admit, May 21st, 2020, the day Question for the Culture was released, is slated to be the most ghetto shit I've ever seen in my life. Elizabeth Woolridge Grant, professionally known as Lana Del Rey, was born into the mid-80s to two parents who worked in the marketing world. As early as her elementary school years, music was interwoven into her pastimes, with Lana singing in her church choir as the cantor, which means that she was the worship leader who took care of many vocal responsibilities, such as choosing and conducting vocals for the choir, starting chants on demand, and correcting missteps made by other choir members. In high school, her uncle taught her how to play guitar, and this seemed to really open up a door in Lana's brain, where her connection to music deepened. She realized that she could, quote, probably write 1 million songs with those 6 chords, end quote. And she went on to pursue songwriting and performance as a hobby in her late teen years. Lana went under many different aliases during this time, like May Jailer, Lizzie Grant, Queen of Coney Island, and my personal favorite, Sparkle Jump Rope Queen. Quirky. A word I would use to describe Lana Del Rey's music would be haunting. She has a very unique approach to storytelling that turns these dark, grotesque themes into ones that appear beautiful at face value due to her melodic crooning and breathy signature. A lot of her music is wittily satirical and otherwise observant of major pop culture moments from early American life, such as from the 50s, 60s, and 70s. At the time of her rather sudden and unanticipated surge to the top of the music industry in 2011, Lana became a sort of unique powerhouse, one far removed from other pop acts of the time. And a lot of that stemmed from the themes that she analyzed in her music and the ways in which she analyzed those themes. One theme that was prevalent in Lana's life growing up was the concept of death, mortality, and the inevitable fate of everyone she knew and loved. She felt anxious and alienated from others and was quotably floored by the fact that her mother and her father and everyone she knew was going to die one day. On the subject, she states, "I had a sort of philosophical crisis. I couldn't believe that we were mortal. For some reason, that knowledge sort of overshadowed my experience. I was unhappy for some time. I got into a lot of trouble. I used to drink a lot. That was a hard time in my life," end quote. This dark underbelly of life has cropped up in Lana's music time and time again. In a biography of her career in life, Stephen Thomas Erlewine states that Lana, quote, envisioned a Southern California dream world constructed of sad girls and bad boys, manufactured melancholy, and genuine glamour, end quote. With such releases like her 2014 album Ultraviolence and 2012's Born to Die, She really came to embody this concept of glamorous morbidity of bygone eras. She was the sad pop track in the back of a slaughter film, and the critics hated it. Since her breakout in 2011, Lana Del Rey has grown accustomed to being slandered in the media for her singing capabilities and the topics that watercolor her music. Before her debut album Born to Die was released in 2012, Lana Del Rey was already the target of scrutiny by the media. People accused her of being an industry plant orchestrated by her record label. Others denounced her as inauthentic due to the drastic change in her image between Born to Die and earlier albums like Lizzie Grant. They insinuated that there were lots of inconsistencies in her music, to the point where it seemed like she was trying to be someone that she wasn't. On this topic, Lana stated, "I came off sort of nervously, and there were just a lot of dualities, a lot of juxtapositions going on that maybe just felt like something was a little off. Maybe the thing that was off was that I needed a little more time or something. And also my path was just so windy just to get to having a first record. I feel like I had to figure it all out by myself. Every move was just guesswork." End quote. But nothing was arguably more infamous than her January 14, 2012 SNL performance. Lana performed 2 songs from her Born to Die album, and the immediate reception was overwhelmingly negative. Critics and the public alike flamed her like she was Chester Cheeto, and I mean, people were coming for her blood. Funny enough, this was my first introduction to Lana Del Rey as an artist, and for it to be something so controversial and something so harsh, that really stuck in my mind until I actually branched off and listened to her music outside of critical articles. People accused her of being a bad singer, of not having any stage presence, and of being sort of bland with her music. I would argue that this Saturday Night Live performance quite possibly followed her and her music career years after it happened, especially when it came to critics who may have refused to take her seriously after the fact. But what do I know? I just make YouTube videos. I'm in a box right now. It was like no matter what Lana Del Rey did, people, and critics especially, found some way to belittle her artistry. This can be noted by her late 2012 rollout of her Ride music video that was slated in the media for being quote-unquote pro-prostitution and quote-unquote anti-feminist. In a 2012 review of Lana's Born to Die album, Kitty Empire describes the record as a thoroughly dissolute and feminist nightmare, and described Lana herself as being purposefully dead behind the eyes. Another 2012 review by Lindsay Zoladz bursts Lana's dream world bubble by comparing the album to a fake organism that doesn't delve deep enough into female sexuality for that critic's liking. Zoladz goes on to say that even though Lana has been the target of sexist criticism in the media based on her looks and her artistry, Lana allegedly doesn't do much to help said critics. Quote, "The sexual politics of Born to Die are troubling too. You'd be hard-pressed to find any song on which Del Rey reveals an interiority or figures herself as anything more complex than an ice cream cone licking object of male desire," end quote. So it's a clear understatement to say that Lana has faced rather harsh, rather stifling criticism across the span of her career, especially when it comes to sexuality, tone, and lyricism. As Zoladz stated in her critique, Lana's debut album was slated as a fantasy world that had you longing for reality. A chance to get away from the shallow glamour and depressing yet over-sexualized nature of her old Hollywood persona. I think it's also important to note here that there is a general belief that Lana Del Rey also romanticizes abuse in her lyrics, especially with the release of her album Ultraviolence. And even though it may not be her intention, I still think it's important to consider the impact it has on survivors who speak against her lyrics. As such, enter stage left, question for the culture.
Suddenly, the world I used to know, I see it differently.
The most frustrating thing about Lana Del Rey's Question for the Culture is the fact that we all collectively know what she was trying to say on May 21st, 2020, especially when you know the history behind her career and how she's often been accused of over-sexualizing and defeminizing her work. But somewhere in that first sentence, the message immediately got misconstrued. Now, to give you a bit of context, Lana Del Rey's Question for the Culture, 1, came at the wrong time, and 2, came at the absolute wrong time ever in the history of wrong timing, ever. Because the week prior to posting it, for the first time in 6 years since Iggy Azalea and Charlie XCX's Fancy, 2 women were holding not only the top spot, but also the second spot on Billboard charts at the same time. And to make matters even more historic, for the first time in history, Black women held the top 2 spots on Billboard chart. Did you hear me? I said for the first time in history, as in never happened before. Talented, brilliant, incredible, amazing, show-stopping, spectacular. It was a time of celebration, of history in the making. And the following week, Lana Del Rey posted this. Now that Doja Cat, Ariana, Camila, Cardi B, Kehlani, and Nicki Minaj and Beyonce had #1s with songs about being sexy, wearing no clothes, fucking, cheating, etc. Can I please go back to singing about being embodied, feeling beautiful by being in love, even if the relationship is not perfect, or dancing for money, or whatever I want without being crucified or saying I'm glamorizing abuse? I'm fed up with female writers and alt singers saying that I glamorize abuse when in reality I'm just a glamorous person singing about the realities of what we are all now seeing are very prevalent in emotionally abusive relationships all over the world. With all of the topics women are finally allowed to explore, I just want to say over the last 10 years, I think it's pathetic that my minor lyrical exploration detailing my sometimes submissive or passive roles in my relationship has often made people say I've set women back hundreds of years. Let this be clear, I'm not a feminist, but there has to be a place in feminism for women who look and act like me. The kind of woman who says no, but men hear yes. The kind of women who are slated mercilessly for being their authentic, delicate selves. The kind of women who get their own stories and voices taken away from them by stronger women or by men who hate women. I've been honest and optimistic about the challenging relationships I've had. Newsflash, that's just how it is for many women. And that was sadly my experience up until the point that those records were made. So I just want to say it's been a long 10 years of bullshit reviews up until recently, and I've learned a lot from them. But I also feel it really paved the way for other women to stop putting on a happy face and to just be able to say whatever the hell they wanted to in their music. Unlike my experience, if I even expressed a note of sadness in my first 2 records, I was deemed literally hysterical as though it was literally the 1920s. There's more, but I think this first page of the think piece is where most people stopped reading anyways, and for pretty good reason. Because after that first sentence, everything after that became exclusively tied to the 7 women she mentioned, and I would argue that that proceeded to tank her entire point soon thereafter. Now, there were many people who read this and kept it moving with their lives, totally oblivious to the implications of Lana's wording. If you are one of those people, you may be listening to this video with full skepticism, the gears in your brain grinding as you contemplate whether or not to scroll down and leave a lengthy comment telling me what Lana really meant. Hold your horses. I'm getting to that. I wholly understand what Lana meant. I know exactly what she was saying, and I still disagree with the post. So what are we going to do now? I can read through it and see a clear connection between her words and the critiques used against her for the past 10 years, especially during her debut into the popular music industry. She has been consistently painted as this oversexed, male-gaze pandering, depressing robot in the media for 10 years straight, and only seemed to catch a break with the release of Norman fucking Rockwell, which is her highest rating album as of late. She has been called the antithesis of feminism. She has been accused of setting women back hundreds of years, all for her take on sexuality and lyricism. 10 years of being accused of something that you're not. 10 years of being ridiculed and demonized for having genuine human emotions. That has to get overwhelming. But Lana's first mistake, in my opinion, is the entire first sentence of her post. Not only is it bad timing because it makes it look like Lana waited until Black women were topping the charts with sexy songs to say anything, especially when sexy songs have been at the forefront of music for years prior without formal questions for the cultures being issued by Miss Del Rey. But overall, the first sentence just makes her sound bitter. Now, two things. I say formal question for the cultures because I think over the span of Lana's career, she has made her stance on the media and the media's treatment of her very clear. My personal favorite being the High by the Beach music video where she just bazookas a paparazzi straight out of the sky. And two, I love bitterness and negativity. I love being evil. And I definitely believe in standing up for yourself when it comes to being as disrespected as Lana has constantly been. So I applaud her for that. But by specifically naming these 7 artists and using the language that she does for them, it comes across like Lana's bitterness is directed at them instead of the critics who have dragged her through the mud over the last 10 years. For the critics who deserve most of her rage, she just gives vague identifiers such as their occupations. That begs the question, why does she specifically call out these 7 women? According to Lana Del Rey, she chose to specifically name these women because those women are the ones that she loves and knows within the industry. And to go even further, Lana creates a system of compare and contrast between herself and these 7 other women by directly naming them and ascribing negative connotations to their artistry with a description like being sexy, wearing no clothes, fucking and cheating, etc., while reserving delicate and more sophisticated connotations for herself with a description like being embodied, feeling beautiful by being in love, etc. Lana unintentionally, and I'm being very generous with that word, creates a rift between her and these other women. She is the delicate and loving type, while these women are the strong and over-sexualized types. You may be saying right now,
but Lana didn't call these women strong or over-sexualized.
And my rebuttal is 1, connotations and what they're associated with are very, very important. Lana uses language that has a negative connotation, like fucking and cheating, to describe the artistry of these women, while using language with positive connotation for herself. She didn't directly say that they were over-sexualized, but she implied it through connotations. And, just so we're on the same page, a connotation refers to the culture or emotion that is associated with words. The connotation of a word isn't its dictionary definition, but rather its cultural or emotional or societal response to that word. So the connotations of the words wearing no clothes, fucking, and cheating invokes a negative emotional or societal response, even if they aren't, by definition, negative words.
It's the motherfucking Eagle Double G.
And number 2, I would argue that by listing and directly naming these artists, our brains naturally continue this game of compare and contrast. Since she directly name-dropped these specific women in the very first sentence, no less, and placed herself in opposition to these women, our first assumption is that every other comparison that we find in the rest of the think piece can be ascribed to these 7 women. For instance, the comparison she makes between herself and quote-unquote stronger women who take away her story and voice. I'm not saying that she wrote that line about these 7 aforementioned women, but like I said, by listing and directly naming these women while putting yourself in opposition to them in the very first sentence, our brains are able to simply fill in the blanks whenever needed because Lana herself doesn't provide any of their names to let our brains make sense of these vague identifiers. So with that being said, let's get into the racial and feminist context. 5 out of 7 of the women Lana Del Rey called out in her Question for the Culture post, by the way, what culture? We're women of color. The funniest thing is, people are convinced that Lana Del Rey doesn't know Ariana Grande is not black. And that's the only reason she included Ariana Grande in the original post. But it's not funny, but it's hilarious. The implication of singling out a group of women of color and ascribing over-sexualized connotations to said group has a history rooted in white supremacy. Yeah, we're going there. Further, positioning herself as the delicate and more submissive, more pure woman in contrast to these women of color also has a history rooted in white supremacy. Lori Kaiser, author of The Black Madonna, Notions of True Womanhood, From Jacobs to Hurston, explains the historical dichotomy between what white women were portrayed to be versus what women of color, especially black women, were portrayed to be. Quote, "The true woman, according to prevailing notions of the period, was a paragon of virtue, a Madonna as it were, pious, pure, submissive, domestic. This view of the ideal woman promoted by whites did not extend to black women, who were too often seen as temptresses with insatiable sexual appetites. Owing to the perceived animal sexuality of black women, the standards of true womanhood could not be seen as applying to them. By psychologically projecting this image of animal sexuality onto black females, the white male absolves himself of the sexual exploitation of black females." So in short, black women have always been stereotyped as being sexual, while white women have typically been associated with delicacy and submission. Let's take this new knowledge of racial stereotypes and apply it to the first sentence of Lana Del Rey's Question for the Culture. She begins by listing a group of predominantly black and mixed women, and using the connotations we discussed earlier, described them using over-sexualized and insatiable language. She then goes on to describe herself using lighter, less sexualized language, and repeatedly refers to herself as delicate and submissive. She implies that the music that she makes, though it's very similar to the music of the other 7 women, just a change in genre, isn't about being sexy, wearing no clothes, fucking, and cheating, but is instead a more pure, pious form of music that talks about being in love and feeling beautiful by being in love. She is the, quote, ideal woman, the paragon of virtue, in quotes, as Lori Kaiser asserts, while the 7 women of color are the, quote, animalistic temptresses with insatiable sexual appetites, end quote. Now, how does this intersect with feminism? Lana states that she's not a feminist, which is horrible and complex wording for no real reason, but she feels that there needs to be a place in feminism for women who look and act like her. The kind of women who are, quote, slated mercilessly for being their authentic, delicate selves. The kind of women who get their own stories and their voices taken away from them by stronger women. We already discussed the system of comparing and contrast that Lana has applied to this entire piece by starting off by comparing herself to these 7 women. In doing so, the language that Lana applies to herself is going to automatically be the opposite for the other women, especially since she has already placed herself in opposition to them. So, our first impression is to assume that the women that Lana mentions in the first sentence and that she places herself in opposition to are not delicate like her, and likely are the strong ones that she's referencing. For centuries, black women have been considered the quote-unquote strong ones, and white women have been the ones in need of protection because they're thought of as the delicate ones. The strong black woman trope is harmful in many ways. It's the reason why the black mother mortality rate is so high in comparison to the white mother mortality rate. It's the reason why black women particularly dark-skinned Black women, are targeted and stripped of their womanhood, like Serena Williams. It's the reason Black women aren't believed when they go through trauma, like Megan Thee Stallion. It's the reason Lana can get away with naming a group of predominantly Black and mixed women, and no one bats an eye because they don't think that it's a big deal. The strong Black woman trope is insidious, and it influences the way we see Black women. Lana calling out a group of predominantly Black women isn't a big deal to her white followers because many of them think that these women can take it. But Lana, the white, delicate, submissive woman, is too delicate to receive criticism from anyone. So Lana gets defended, a little violently might I add, while the Black women are left to stick up for themselves because they're quote-unquote stronger. Got it? Good. Now, let's talk about white feminism. Lana makes a number of statements that have historically been linked to white feminism. And, just so you know, I'm not referencing Lana's race when I call her a white feminist. Anyone can be a white feminist. White feminism is the opposite of intersectional feminism. It's feminism that focuses on the struggle of white cisgendered women alone without heeding the intersections that also oppress women of color. T. Noor has a hilarious and great video on the topic if you want to get other perspectives. The whole notion that Lana thinks there needs to be a feminism that includes women who look like her is a poor take, a cold take, a frozen take. Like, I know what she meant, and I'm sure by now we all know what she meant, but that doesn't negate the impact of the statement. Feminism has always made room for women who look like Lana, and has consistently kicked out and ostracized women of color for the sake of whiteness. Mariana Ortega, author of Being Lovingly, Knowingly Ignorant, White Feminism and Women of Color, examines white feminism and the ways in which white women, denoted here as the perceiver, use women of color for their own benefit despite, quote, ignoring, ostracizing, rendering invisible, and stereotyping, in quote, women of color in the first place. Quote, the perceiver and the knower are actually involved in the production of knowledge about women of color, whether by citing their work, reading and writing about them, or classifying them, while at the same time using women of color to the perceiver's own ends. Thus, there is a sense in which this loving, knowing ignorance has nothing to do with love, although the perceiver may claim that it does. That sounds very familiar. Do you see where that connects to Lana? Oh, it's right behind me? Lana cites the work of these women of color, she writes about them, and she classifies them by ascribing to them her own definition of their artistry. And then she claims that she only name-dropped them because she loves them, and that they are her favorite artists. According to Mariana Ortega, it has nothing to do with love, and everything to do with using women of color to the perceiver's own ends. Ortega goes on to explain how the perceived knowledge that white feminists have of women of color, quote, may be inaccurate or may inadequately represent the experience of actual women of color and consequently leads to ignorance. And if we take a look at Lana's comment section, where a bunch of her fans take the inaccurate, over-sexualized connotations that Lana posits against these women of color, where they continue that narrative as a way to be hostile against other Black women in the comment section, we can see that applying to Lana as well. And I say that these over-sexualized connotations that Lana applies to the 7 women are inaccurate or inadequate because Lana makes it seem like these 7 women only sing about sex, when every single one of these artists have songs unrelated to sex, unrelated to cheating or fucking or wearing no clothes. They are multifaceted, just like Lana is multifaceted, because she sings about DILFs and love. And let's get to the smoking gun. The Lana Paved the Way crowd, which, funnily enough, includes Lana herself. Lana states that she, quote-unquote, paved the way for other women to stop putting on a happy face. Since she's so generously provides some women she thinks is now able to do all the things she couldn't, we can assume that she thinks that she paved the way for these artists to sing about sex or sadness or what have you. Now, I admit, Lana has definitely paved the ways for some artists. Namely, I would say artists like Billie Eilish. Never in my entire life would I ever consider Lana Del Rey paving the way for any of those 7 women. Because for one, they're not even in the same musical genre. And you know what? While we're on the subject, why didn't Lana name drop Taylor Swift, who has been quoted to say that she's inspired by Lana's lyricism? Mariana Ortega will tell you why. She states, "The well-meaning white feminist who perceives with a loving eye to some extent uses the work of women of color in her academic or political discussions. Her discussion has the double function of 1, legitimating the words of the woman of color used, and 2, legitimating her own status as a third-wave feminist. She sees herself as someone who really understands women of color, who is putting the voices of these women on the map, who is, quote-unquote, giving them a voice. She constructs a world in which the words of women of color are quoted briefly rather than analyzed in depth, in which the experience of women of color are homogenized, in which women of color are seen as half-subjects who need to be given a voice." And I think that quote is especially reminiscent of Lana's question for the culture, because Lana also uses that post to solidify her position in feminism. She calls for a third wave of feminism despite, there already being a third wave. She implies that she has given these women of color a voice to talk about themes of sadness and sex. She is the loving, ignorant, white feminist who uses the name and artistry of women of color to strengthen her point. She perpetuates the strong black woman trope and the sexualized black woman trope because no one will defend these women the way they defend her. The truth of the matter is, it doesn't matter what Lana meant to say, because the subtleties of her language and the implication of her words are far more damaging. I want to give you an example of how a person's intent can be garbled by their impact. 3 months ago, I posted a video titled, "Why Social Media Influencers Stay Silent About Social Justice." In that video, I talk about social media influencers who didn't necessarily use their platform much to discuss the Black Lives Matter movement, aside from a few posts. Just like Lana, I referenced 2 content creators that I loved watching at the time, who I just thought happened to be Asian American women. But they were the only creators I name dropped. Without even thinking of the impact of doing so, I placed 2 Asian American women in a video that more or less talked about white privilege. Someone rightfully called me out for that and explained to me how that rhetoric buys into the model minority myth and how it can be damaging to Asian Americans. And I swiftly took a step back to assess how I might have been harming the people I said I respected. It doesn't matter that I referenced those 2 artists because I loved their content. What mattered was the implications of me doing so. I'm grateful to have people who care enough or believe enough in me to notice something that I did was wrong, correct me, and allow me to alter my thinking. People sought to educate Lana and her fans to show them both how that sort of language continues to oppress Black women, continues to ostracize us, and continues to harm us. And we were called crazy for it. We were told we were reaching, we were told we were uneducated, we were told we can't read. We were silenced, all because her fans wanted to protect a white woman's feelings over Black people's lives. Lana Del Rey's fans failed her by not letting her see how her actions were wrong. Instead of asking her to take a step back and listen, they allowed her to close her eyes to the damage that she caused. They don't even love their idol or respect their idol enough to let their idol grow. And that is the saddest part of this whole situation. And Lana herself is not removed from this blame. Instead of being an adult and listening to criticism, she let her fans step in front of her to take the brunt of the backlash. And then she went on to act like nothing happened. Instead of educating herself, she continued to push back against the constructive criticism because she was too prideful to admit that she was wrong. I think people like to undermine impact because of someone's intention and they were different. And I understand how someone can mean to say one thing and feel attacked when other people don't understand. But Lana's not a child. She's in her 30s. Yes, she's human, so we shouldn't treat her like garbage, but she's a grown adult. Her brain is already done forming up there. She should be able to take a step back, realize what she said had negative connotations, and own up to it instead of trying to paint everyone else as uneducated haters. Lana's fans failed her, but she failed herself too. Mic drop, bitch.
Baby, baby, you are really hurting me. 'Cause every